Let's sit back and discuss the video about the life of soldiers during the American Civil War in the next few minutes. We will find out who fought against whom, what weapons were used, what they led to, and how ordinary soldiers of those times lived. We've also eliminated a few myths and collected many examples of a pivotal conflict in U.S. history. On our way, we will be accompanied by a guest, Rick Kane. The action took place in 1863, during the war that began in 1861 and ended in 1865. To understand the scale of this conflict, let's remember that the Civil War was the bloodiest event in the history of the American continent. Approximately 5 million people participated in this war, which is 1/6 of the U.S. population at that time. The Civil War was terrible and bloody, but most importantly, it was principled. Our guest, Rick, was a soldier in the Confederate States of America, which is also known as the South among the masses. The Confederate States is the collective name for states that were effectively independent during the Civil War. Moreover, the independence of the Southern states was recognized by Great Britain and France. It all started with 6 Southern states that announced their withdrawal from the United States of America after the annexation of Texas on March 2, 1861. Later, the number of states of the Confederation will reach 13. The reason for their separation was the policy of the new U.S. President, Abraham Lincoln, who, being a Republican, actively opposed slavery, which was the basis of the economy not only of the Southern states, but of the whole country as a whole. In 1860, the Southern states produced 75% of American exports, the bulk of which were slaves. The value of slaves exceeded the total value of all factories, plants, and ports in the country. Not surprisingly, the issue of slavery became unacceptable to the Southern states, and this became the main cause of the war according to most sources. On this point, Lincoln himself expressed himself most accurately when he stated in the New York Tribune, "If I can save the Union without freeing even one slave, I will. If I can save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I will. And if I can save the Union by freeing only a part of the slaves and leaving the rest, I will do that too." In general, for Lincoln, slaves were not the main problem, to put it mildly. As with the rest of the North, taxes were his main concern, and the issue of slavery was secondary. The North wanted to keep control of the South, while the South wanted to keep its way of life and prevent people from other states from imposing their will. And so our guest, Rick, along with another 1,200,000 men from the South, ended up at the front. Here again we are confronted with the myth that the Southerners were mostly farmers and slave owners, while the Army of the North was diverse in skin color, age, and social status. Ironically, it was actually the other way around. There are accurate statistics that show that the average age of a soldier in the Army of the North was 21 years old, and the vast majority of them were white farmers called up for service as part of the mobilization. At the same time, the most motley crowd gathered in the South. In his memoirs, one of the commanders of the Southern Army, Robert Watson, marveled at the diversity of his subordinates. Poles, Swedes, Irish, Brazilians, Portuguese, Germans, and British are just a part of the variety described by Watson. It's funny that the ideas of equality and brotherhood were actually characteristic of the slave-owning South and not of the North. Equality, of course, had its limitations, especially given that a white person has always been considered superior to a black person. However, there is also another myth here. In the Army of the North, things were about the same way, with racism and segregation. In the United States, the victory over discrimination and racism came only in the second half of the 20th century. So it is naive to believe the articles that claim that during the Civil War there was no discrimination between blacks and whites in the Army of the North. Such were the customs at that time in the United States. The North did not oppose slavery out of the goodness of the soul, unlike the rich agriculture in the South. For the North, it was necessary to emphasize industry, where slave labor was useless and skilled workers were needed. The invisible hand of the market was at work here, and people were valuable regardless of skin color. This is a completely different story. In the meantime, back to our guest, Patrick Kane. Theodore Girish has an excellent book about the everyday life of ordinary soldiers of the Civil War. On every page, Kane notes that the main problem of the soldiers was not the battle itself, but the disease. Malaria, pneumonia, and tuberculosis claimed far more lives than all the battles combined. For example, during the 4 years of the war, 94,000 people died in battle among the Confederates, while 164,000 died from diseases during the same period. It is worth remembering that we are talking about the middle of the 19th century, when the concept of field medicine and sanitation was not yet fully developed, and the Army was at the stage of transformation. The same can be said about the daily life of the military. The 19th century was a time of beautiful formations and tactical maneuvers by groups of troops consisting of tens of thousands of soldiers. The previously mentioned Robert Watson describes the hard routine of an ordinary soldier. Getting up at 5 a.m., breakfast, drill, checking weapons, joint drill with another regiment, lunch, drill, evening drill, dinner, drill, and sleep. There is no need to add anything here. A soldier must be constantly ready, and recruits noted that the most difficult moments in the war were precisely the first weeks, when the schedule was only drill exercises and nothing else. Why did our Patrick Kane need all this? This is another mythology. Southerners were not exclusively slave owners willing to die for the opportunity to have slaves, just as Northerners did not die just to free slaves. Each had their own motives. In the Army of the South, due to its heterogeneity, various motivations were manifested. This was especially evident among the soldiers of the 36th Brigade from Wisconsin. Guy Taylor, in his letter to his wife, explained his motivation in one word: freedom. Almost certainly this statement would be relevant for 9 out of 10 fighters, regardless of whether they belonged to the northern or southern regions. The concept of freedom had different meanings for each of them, which is a characteristic feature of any war. Another characteristic of the battlefield is the dominance of the infantry from the Middle Ages to the present day. It is the infantry that determines the outcome of any battle. Cavalry and artillery were also present in the Civil War, but 75% of the Confederate Army were foot soldiers, and more than 90% of all wounds inflicted in battle were the result of firearms. At first glance, the rifles of the soldiers of that time did not differ much from the muskets used during the Napoleonic Wars. However, as early as 1860, the armies of both sides in the American Civil War were heavily armed with rifles with rifled barrels. This meant that the range and accuracy of fire were close to modern standards. However, the rate of fire still left much to be desired. In 1860, a trained fighter was considered capable of firing 10 shots in 5 minutes. Our Patrick fought with the Enfield rifle, which was tested during the Crimean War. It wasn't the fastest weapon, but it was reliable, and firing at 800 meters allowed the bullets to tear through the bodies of their victims. At the time, there was no convention against the use of destructive cartridges, and the low level of medical care on the battlefield made taking a bullet almost fatal. Northerners preferred Springfield rifles, and also used one of the first repeating carbines in history, Spencer carbines. The Spencer carbine was a fundamentally new type of weapon that could fire 7 rounds in 7 seconds. However, in this conflict, its use did not have a significant impact, as did the use of bayonets, which gradually faded into the past. The very concept of a rifle with a rifled barrel implies a minimal need for close combat. Thus, a total of 922 people died from gunshot wounds in all 4 years of the Civil War. Most of them died as a result of drunken fights or riots, which is typical for any large-scale conflict. This war also pioneered the application of future technologies. The soldiers of the South were the first to use mines, which are artillery shells with a fuse buried in the ground. However, this technology was still crude. The Northerners solved this problem by sending captured Southerners to clear mines, since they were familiar with the principle of the mines. In addition to this, grenades such as Ketchum and Excelsior kinds also began to be used in the Civil War. They were also converted explosive devices for artillery. However, like mines, they were rarely used due to the crude technology, and often the grenades exploded in the hands of those who threw them. The end of the conflict ended with the defeat of our Patrick Kane and the Southerners, and now everyone describes it like this. Thus, the spiritualized Northerners, fighting for the just cause of the abolition of slavery, left the demoralized Southerners no chance. Of course, this is a consequence of the fact that history is written by the winners. In fact, at the beginning of the war, the South held the advantage, as they had more qualified officers and access to the wealth of local slave owners, which allowed them to supply the army at a high level. Two events in 1863 were watersheds. Lincoln used the forbidden trick of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which was intended to undermine the South from within, and the measure worked. Many black people began to flee from their masters, and the European powers, which had long ago abolished slavery, began to send help and resources in large volumes. The second turning point was the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place from July 1 to July 3, 1863. This battle ended in a draw, but for the South, which at that time was in front, it was almost like a defeat. From that moment on, the Confederation lost the initiative, and the North began to dictate its terms. The decisive factor was the gap in human and industrial resources. The Army of the North was twice as large. There were many more factories in the North, and the number of railways was 3 times higher than in the South. The manpower and the ability of industry to provide for the Army did not leave the South any chance. The total number of victims was also higher on the side of the North, where 640,000 people died, while in the South the losses amounted to less than 500,000. Despite some other positive metrics in favor of the Confederation, this could not help them, since the North had progressive ideas and support from Europe on the side. Here ends our discussion. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a cam up mark below it. Until we meet again, friends.